So why don't I start by defining what I mean by South Vietnam versus South Vietnamese government. So by South Vietnam, I'm referring to the entire area or the entire southern half of Vietnam below the 17th parallel. By South Vietnamese government, I mean the government that was based in Saigon and allied with the United States during the war. Most Americans call this regime the South Vietnamese government, but this regime didn't actually rule all of South Vietnam. It was strongest in the cities, but rather weak in the countryside. So even though I'm calling it the South Vietnamese government to make it easier to understand, keep in mind that it doesn't actually control all of this entire area that it claims to. In the countryside, the majority of the population were poor peasants, and they largely were supportive of the NLF, and they saw it as more legitimate than the South Vietnamese government. The reason why the peasants did not view the South Vietnamese government as legitimate, or one of the reasons, was because in the mid-1950s and the latter half of the 1950s, the South Vietnamese government implemented a land reform that, although it was meant to benefit the peasants, it was so conservative that many peasants actually were worse off because of it. The South Vietnamese government also recognized the rights of landlords who had largely lost their land during the earlier First Indochina War. Then in the early 1960s, after the NLF formed, it redistributed land. So it took land away from the landlords and gave it to poor tenant farmers and sharecroppers. And in doing so, it won over much of the peasantry. At the same time that this was happening, the South Vietnamese government also implemented policies in the countryside, but those policies were very unpopular. Some of those policies entailed the forcible relocation of peasants, so this generated a lot of resentment. So that's why the peasants often felt that the NLF defended their interests more, or represented their interests more than the South Vietnamese government. But popular support for the NLF fell in the mid-1960s and afterwards as the war escalated, especially with the introduction of American ground troops. Once there were Americans on the ground in South Vietnam, the NLF now faced a more powerful enemy than it had before. And in response, the NLF increased its demand on the peasantry. So it drafted more poor young men, poor peasant men to fight. It taxed the population more heavily than it did before. It demanded more labor from villagers, and it also used violence to ensure obedience to a greater degree than before. And because of that, there were some peasants who became disillusioned with the NLF. They came to see that it was oppressive and unjust. Peasant discontentment with the NLF probably peaked after the Tet Offensive of 1968. The NLF had claimed that it was going to overthrow the government in Saigon, and when it failed to achieve that, many peasants felt that the NLF couldn't actually live up to its promises. But even as the popular support for the NLF fell in the countryside, it still remained more popular among the peasants than the South Vietnamese government.